pipelines.
And we welcome you to a special edition of In the Frequency of Hope on this Memorial Day 2018. You are listening and watching WRWK 93.9 LPFM. What does that LP stand for? It stands for low power. And what does that mean? It means we are 100% volunteer run, owned, operated, and we need your help. So if you're on our Facebook page, The Work FM, or if you check out our website, theworkfm.org, we invite you to check out that donate button. Oh, yes. We are sitting here today for some very special shows, and I'm going to let our host tell you about that. Actually, our hostess tell you about that in just a moment. But I invite you to remember two things about today's show. Number one, it is Memorial Day, and we would like to take a moment to be thankful for all of our servicemen and women who gave the ultimate sacrifice and gave their lives in order that we as Americans are free, that we have the rights as granted to us under the U.S. Constitution, and that wherever you are today, whatever you're doing, you are able to do those things and enjoy those things because of their service. And then we would like to remind you that the opinions and the viewpoints that are expressed in this program are not necessarily those of WRWK, all of its volunteers, staff, and affiliates. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our hostess with the mostest, Miss Stephanie, and her special guest.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you so much for tuning in today. We do have a really special program for you. I'm absolutely honored to be able to interview and help introduce Abigail Spanberger to the listeners, excuse me, here in Virginia 7. In the 7th District, you have a Democratic primary coming up on, well, in the state, we have a Democratic primary coming up on June the 12th. And for the 7th District, the winner of the Democratic primary will go on to face Dave Brett, who is the incumbent and Republican in the House of Representatives, Joe Walton, the Libertarian, who is in the running, and Helen Ali, who is running as a Whig. And that's what we're here to discuss today, is to bring you guys a little more information so that you can make a decision when it comes to primary time. And I'm just really thrilled to be able to bring you that information today. So without further ado, let's say hello to Abigail. Hi, hello. Abigail. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the listeners who are listening in.
Yeah.
Or watching on Facebook.
I appreciate you making the time. I know that in this season, campaign season, at this stage of the game, that every second counts, and every second is accounted for, and that there's not a whole lot of sleeping going on because there's a whole lot of work to do. So I appreciate you making time to come out and talk to us today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So I guess one of the things that I want to dive right in and talk to people about is maybe starting off with the job description. I think would be really helpful for a lot of our listeners to really understand, why is it that you're running? What is it that you think that you'll be doing once you get there? So maybe for some of our listeners, we can start off with talking about, what does a representative actually do in the House of Representatives?
Sure. So a representative in the House of Representatives, there are has a couple roles. And so working to create federal legislation that impacts not just our community, but our country overall. And then also our representative has a role in constituent services, so helping the people who live in their district. And so to break that down on the legislative side, what that would mean is that any of the federal laws that come out of Washington and are either originating with the Senate or the House of Representatives. And so any elected representative from the Virginia 7th District would have a significant role in working to create, meeting with other representatives to come up with ideas and push forth legislation that would impact the people of this district and the entire country, and working to ensure that when Washington, as we like to say, or when the House of Representatives is working to pass bills or bring things forth in committee, that they're talking about the issues that are most impacting people here in the 7th District. So that's one piece of it, and it's the primary piece, ensuring that the legislation that's being passed is something that we can get behind, and that our representative is working to make sure that she's pushing forth legislation that's impactful for people in this district. And then there's a piece on the constituent services side, which is where there's so many people who have concerns and needs and don't know where to take those concerns, and be it with veterans benefits, be it something related to Social Security. And it's great to have a kind of a point person. And in many ways, the office of your representative can be that point person. And so it's incredibly important that our representatives have a strong staff that are responding to needs. And you hear really lovely stories, heartwarming stories about representatives who are able to get veterans a replacement for an award that was won, or these sorts of things, helping people really on the path to ensure that they're getting the benefits that they should be getting. And so those are the two primary pieces. And then looking at the role of government overall, we do have the legislative branch that's supposed to be a co-equal branch of government with the judicial and the executive branch. And so ensuring that we have a member of Congress here from the 7th who will work together with other members of Congress to really be that strong voice, especially when we do have an executive branch that is taking a lot of liberties with the way that he is proceeding, I'll say delicately.
Excellent. Excellent. And so inside that, I've heard you talk a little bit about your inspiration for running. What is your expectation once you're there about how you'll be able to do this job differently than perhaps your predecessor? And how is that going to impact me as a citizen in the 7th District?
Yes. So comparing the job that I would do to the job that's currently being done by our incumbent, I think is a multi-tiered comparison. In terms of politics, he's a very conservative Republican. I'm a Democrat. So even in terms of where we align on policy, there are many votes that he has cast that I would not have agreed with. Among them, the tax bill that added estimates are now $1.9 trillion to the deficit, the House healthcare bill last May that, if it hadn't been stopped on the Senate side, would have taken healthcare away from millions of Americans, including the protections we all know and love, such as pre-existing conditions protections, lifetime cap, eliminating the lifetime cap, those sorts of things. So electing someone different would mean advocating for different policies. But in addition to that, when I frequently talk about my background is I'm a CIA officer, and I was working to understand complex issues, predominantly nuclear proliferation, terrorism, some narco trafficking issues, Russia issues. And so my role was to dive deep into what it is that the United States government knew about a particular issue and what it is that we needed to know in order to drive our policy or keep our country safe from a terrorist threat, or walk into a negotiating table with the information sort of necessary to engage in productive, fruitful conversations. And so that background as a legislator, I think, is an incredibly valuable one, because when we're looking at healthcare policy or gun violence prevention policy or environmental policy or infrastructure, I mean, everything, essentially, it's looking at what are the policies that we have in place and how are those impacting or not impacting the communities here in the 7th, and how could we advocate for legislation that would provide for or address the challenges of the people here in the district. I think my approach would be different than our current incumbent. A most kind of basic comparison is that he hasn't held a public town hall, in over a year at this point. And for me, being accessible and accountable to people that, currently I'm asking for their vote, but ideally in the future, if I have their vote, I think that's tremendously important. We've done exactly 100 meet and greets across the district in all 10 counties since I launched the campaign. And those are events that some of them are very open to public, some of them are neighborhoods. People invite neighbors and friends, depends on the host's preference, but really an opportunity for me to get out and meet people and listen to people's concerns, answer questions, and ensure that I have that personal connection with so many people and that I can understand and hear a particular story that equates to a challenge we might read about in the paper. Because it's understanding the real personal impact of people here in the 7th. I think that's incredibly important. And so among the things that are that I have prioritized is, if I'm elected, I intend to have one town hall in every single county. We like to joke we've done 100 events so far, in addition to all the other meetings we attend, that certainly one town hall in every county should be pretty straightforward, manageable. But I think people deserve that level, and especially at a time when we have so much anxiety, and depending upon where your politics lie, and again, I'm a Democrat, when you check on Twitter and you see on Facebook and it feels like the world is shifting beneath your feet, I think that it's incredibly important that people have the ability to ask questions of their representative, or even to be present, or to have some sort of access to the person who's supposed to represent their interests, so that they can feel confident that that person is or isn't representing their interests. And so I think it's tremendously important. And that's a difference between me and the incumbent.
Excellent. Excellent. I appreciate that. I think that's one of the things that I'm always looking for. Is it a matter of party loyalty? So somebody has to run. Or where do I see where I can use, or where do you see, excuse me, in whatever we're approaching, where do you see where you can apply your gifts, your talents to whatever this is, and how does that benefit you and everyone? Yeah. And so thank you. I appreciate that. So I'm going to dive into a handful of juicy topics because, right, the news is chock full of juicy topics. And there's a couple of different things that I have been reading about most recently that give me pause, I suppose, I want to say, about some decisions that are being made. And we'll start off with one of my favorites today, is talking about this military budget, with the very well-deserved raise for our soldiers, and of course the extra money for a parade, and kicking some cash to the wall. And so, wrapped up in that question, I'm going to be getting into some other border issues, because I'm sure that you, like everyone else, have heard some pretty disturbing news coming from border issues most recently. So I want to start off with talking about really, see, we're diverging already. It's so hard.
It makes it more interesting, doesn't it?
I guess what I really want to start with on that then is I really want to dive right into comprehensive immigration reform. What part does the House have in reining in the excessive use of a force like ICE, which really is a new force that was created after 9/11. We have to ask if it's really still a necessary thing, and if the way that we're utilizing that is really to the best that our country has to offer, our own citizens, as well as citizens of the world, because at one time we were known for, the ideals that are associated with Lady Liberty. And we've definitely moved away from that posture, I would say, at least in a verbal sense, coming from the administration down. However, we still face the issues where even though some of us who are here might think that things aren't going so swell, we still have to face the fact that people die every day trying to get here because this is so much better.
Yeah.
And what's on the other side of that policy decision to shut people out of any possibility toward whatever it is that we have to offer them that that they gave up so much to try to get to.
Yeah.
So here it comes. Here it comes.
There's a lot.
Yeah, I know. Here it comes. So with ICE in particular, with what's been happening with ICE, now I recognize that very much, just like what we've done with our police force, we've charged them with far too much responsibility, nowhere near enough training, nowhere near enough funding, and I think that we've treated this secondary force similarly, although I question the funding. I think they have some funding. They're not strapped like our local police departments are. It concerns me greatly that they are being given such vast authority really outside the scope of the people. In no way, shape, or form, I don't believe for 1 second that had anyone floated this policy concept in front of any people from America, that they would have been okay with that. Nobody would have said that's okay to separate minors, infants even, from their parents at the border and then potentially send them into detention facilities. While the parents work out their legal issues. And so I guess from the perspective of in the House, how can the House be impactful and help rein in an organization that's being pushed by the administration that way? Because really it's through funding.
So there's a couple things. I mean, first off,
sorry, that was huge. I know.
No, it's funny because it's not funny, but I was just listening because I agree with you on the emotional piece of it. Watching some of the reports that I've seen recently and reading some of the news reports have been horrifying, and I think the idea of taking a baby out of his or her parents' arms, it betrays who we are as a people, and we are at a point right now where what we as an American population, I think, really need to reject this notion that there's this othering of people. And, we heard the administration refer to people as animals just a week and a half ago. And then people said, oh, no, just certain people. And I think it's a really dangerous precedent. And history shows us certainly that it's a dangerous precedent when you start grouping different people. If they want to talk about gang members who are criminal gang members, we can call them criminal gang members. So I'm certainly not in any way trying to advocate for anything less than kind of recognizing threats when we see threats. I'm a former CIA officer. I'm a former law enforcement officer. I am not. I'm not soft on criminal gangs, but I think it's important that we point out the threats that we perceive. If it's narco trafficking, if it's criminal gang activity, that's what it is. It isn't immigration. It isn't this person. And so when we get to this point where we're actually even just looking at other people in a different way, I think that becomes very detrimental to the American psyche and how we handle these conversations. We absolutely, and I think most people agree, we need immigration reform. We need to recognize how it is that we can secure our borders in a way that's effective, in a way that doesn't have tremendous environmental impact or geopolitical impact or fiscal impact. And we also need to really address what are the goals that we're trying to achieve as a country, and certainly Congress needs to be paying attention to that when they're setting forth and talking about legislation that might impact that might affect immigration reforms. But what I think is detrimental is when we see many people using the DACA recipients or dreamers as a bargaining chip, because they are people, they are students, they are the university students, they are young professionals, they are people within our communities who, in the case of DACA students who came here through no fault of their own, came here as children with their parents. This is the country they know. And so looking at them as bargaining chips, I think, is actually the wrong approach, because it isn't solving an immigration issue. It isn't addressing how it is that we can address an immigration issue. It's talking about that particular group as a bargaining chip where we're on parties disagreeing. And I think it's incredibly important that we look at what is a goal with immigration reform. Because immigration has tremendous economic implications, social implications, implications for large corporations that need employees, implications for Social Security, because many illegal immigrants, people who are not working here legally, are paying into the Social Security program. And so that's incredibly important. So we need to make sure that we're looking at all of the implications that our current immigration status quo has, and then move from there to recognize how is it that we can adapt policy that serves a purpose. So in securing our borders, is it to stop the trafficking of narcotics across the border, or the trafficking of people, or is it to cut down on the number of people who are here without legal status? Because if that's our sole goal, we also have to recognize that many people come here on an airplane with a valid visa and then overstay their visa. So even when we're looking at numbers of people who are, in the U.S. without legal status, many of them don't come across the southern border. So constructing a wall doesn't actually solve that problem, if that's the problem we're trying to solve. And so I think that members of Congress need to be to kind of get to your question, members of Congress need to be really attuned to what are the problems that we are trying to solve. In the 7th District, we have really significant immigrant communities from all over the world, and many of them in a wide array of jobs. We have many of the positions of engineers and physicians that are required, that we need people in those jobs. Those are people who came here from other countries. And so that's an incredible richness to our community, that we have people filling these jobs who originally came from another country. But because of the backlog in our immigration system, when people are not sure of what their next step is, if they are interested in pursuing a green card, or they don't know how long it'll take, those families make different choices. Maybe they aren't choosing to buy a house because they don't know if they'll get their green card, or they don't know if they're going to potentially become a citizen, or they, maybe don't settle in and put their kids in activities because it may be more temporary. And so I think there's so many social implications in addition to the economic ones about our immigration policy, that we really need to be defining what our goals are. And as a former intelligence officer, I think there's great value in ensuring that our borders are secure, particularly from potential terrorists who would cross the border, from narco traffickers who would bring drugs across the border. But we need to look at those problems. They're, of course, related, but they are different problems than people coming across the border looking for work. In what we've seen recently, the really, I think, horrifying thing is that now under the new administration, or the Trump administration, where every cross into the United States is considered a criminal act, there are people who are crossing into the United States and going straight to law enforcement and saying, I want to apply for asylum, and that is their right. And so the fact that someone is being detained and their child's being ripped from their arms when they are saying, I need asylum, those are people who are fleeing war, who are fleeing drug traffickers, who are fleeing intense, incredible, horrific violence. And to then put them in a position where now we're ripping apart their families, to put people whose lives are in danger in a position where they have to decide, well, do I want to risk losing my child if I cross into the U.S., or should I stay in this place where my life is in danger as is? And so I think that is a tremendous policy initiative that is, it doesn't do anything to make our country safer. It doesn't do anything with the goal of immigration reform. It's just really brutal, and I think against our values as a people. So, these are all of the sorts of conversations that need to be happening in Congress. And I think in some groups they are, but it is a conversation that needs to pivot to the public sphere as well. And related to the value or the purpose of ICE. When ICE was put together, multiple organizations came together under the umbrella of ICE for the purpose of, the importation of goods in addition to the people crossing borders, so that we could have, so that we could, under Homeland Security, have a better view of what risks are facing our country. I think when we pivoted towards a primarily counterterrorism focus, then that it did change the tenor of the way that ICE agents were engaging with people, because now there's a move from patrolling or protecting the borders to this idea that I'm keeping terrorists out, or we are protecting the homeland in a different way that becomes more of a focus of what offense is that person looking to commit.
Okay, great. Thank you. No, I appreciate that. And I know
there was a follow-up, but it's up to you if you want.
Okay. Well, that's going to tuck in nicely because I'm not quite done.
Okay.
No, I appreciate that. So the question, I'll tell you what this question is, and then I'll tell you what I was going to lead to next, because this is the part that like where the rubber meets the road. Like, I want to talk about action.
Yeah.
Because that's what gets me going. So the question that came in was, how did you feel about Ivanka Trump posting a picture of herself in the midst of this crisis, snuggling with her own son? What I wanted to say was, if you're my representative and I find out that an organization that is funded by my government has outfitted a bus with seats for toddlers to transport them to detention units, I want to know that I'm going to call my representative and that you're going to do something that yanks the chain and makes that stop immediately.
Yeah.
I apologize, my emotional, but when I read that report and saw the photo of that bus,
photos of the bus,
I was like,
because when you look at the photo of that bus, it's clear that the adults are not supposed to be there.
We get a lot of reaction from that one.
Yeah. There's the legislative piece, and then there's the piece where you have a voice. You have people who listen to you. You have people who are engaged. And I'll be honest, I mean, as a candidate, even, there's a new level of responsibility that I think is there, where you can add to a conversation in a negative way. You can add to a conversation in a positive way. You can stand up for the principles that are important, that are the principles you want to carry into elected office. And so even if there is not something from a legislative perspective that immediately Congress can do and flip a switch and that bus is gone, I think everyone who can visualize, she's messaging with a heart, anyone who can visualize what that bus means and the fact that there are like broken lives and traumatized children on a bus has a responsibility to say it is wrong and we need to stop this. And whatever solutions whatever problem we're trying to fix by putting babies on a bus without their parents, it is clearly not working, because they just outfitted a bus to put babies on a bus without their parents. And so as your elected representative, I would want people to know that it is wrong to treat families that way. It is wrong to treat any other person that way, whether they are an American, whether or not they have a dream of coming to this country, or whether or not they're fleeing horrific violence. And every person who has a voice, for whatever reason, be it because they're in elected office or because they're a community leader, or they have a responsibility to stand up for the principles and the things that are right and wrong. And to me, this is this one is black and white. It is wrong to rip babies from their families' arms, and we know that because we didn't used to do it this way. We used to keep families together in detention centers.
Alrighty. While I collect myself, let me remind our listeners that it's 4:30 in the afternoon. Today is Monday, May the 28th. It's Memorial Day, and I really appreciate you tuning in for a special episode. Today, I am interviewing Abigail Spanberger. She is running in the Democratic primary on June the 12th. And the winner of the Democratic primary will then go on to face Helen Ali, Joe Walton, thank you. I had to sneak a peek, sorry. And Dave Bratt, who is the incumbent. Alrighty, I'm going to move on to a different topic so that I don't get quite so teared up again. How about that? Maybe. We'll try. This is going to lead, I kind of want to use that to kind of slide right in because I see the two issues are linked in a couple of different ways. So if we can kind of pivot from there and then go into talking about some justice reform. Mm-hmm. And the link that I'm talking about in particular is the private for-profit prison industry, yep. Which is a part of the quote-unquote detention centers to house our quote-unquote immigrant problem. And the fact that people don't automatically see internment camp when that I don't even understand what they're thinking and how they're not seeing that direct correlation. Anyway, prison reform, justice reform. I read another report today. I want to say the guy's maybe from Tennessee, West Virginia. I don't remember. Back in the 90s, I think he was he was found guilty of selling drugs. Mm-hmm. He was put in jail for 50 some years. They let him out accidentally early. He was a model citizen in prison. He's been a model citizen since he got out. And the Justice Department has decided that he was let out early and he needs to finish his sentence. So he's being sent back. And I question, the bigger question that I want to ask in that is, how do we move from what we are doing into something else, since you do have the experience that you have? How do we move out of this system? I see it as a system change. How do we move away from this into something that sees, that acknowledges that, I have his name here in an article someplace, I could even drag it up for you, that he has literally done exactly what we asked of him during his time in prison, which was to become educated, get himself straight, and then become a productive member of society. And he did all of those things. And yet we are going to go ahead and limit his freedom for another 10 years or so, because, it's a mandatory sentence. And I recognize that justice is well outside of mm-hmm. the responsibility in the House. But in crafting law, we have to make a shift.
100%. And there's
so many of these things, to me, go together.
And there's so much space for criminal justice
economic link.
Reform. And I think it fundamentally comes down to, what is our goal in imprisoning people? Is it punitive, or is it restorative? Are we working to prepare people for reentry? And so in looking at, I think, a self-assessment of who we as a nation are and how we view our criminal justice system, the goal of a person's entry into prison has to be something that people are discussing, because I think frequently people don't think about that or talk about that. But when we look at our prison population, we are 5% of the world's population. We are 25% of the world's imprisoned population. So we have a wholly disproportionate number of people who we imprison compared to other countries, other industrialized first world countries. And so the question has to be, why and how is it that this is happening? And from a legislative perspective, there is a lot that we can do. Looking at mandatory sentences, one of the things you mentioned, whether or not our mandatory sentence is appropriate. And should we let the discretion of a judge or a jury determine what someone's sentence is for a particular crime? And my position is yes, because there are so many different factors to be considered, community to community, and offense to offense, and perpetrator to perpetrator, and that's why we have a judge and jury system, so that we can allow for sentencing to potentially be tailored to a level. I mean, I recommended sentencing, I agree with, but real mandatory sentencing to the point where they would send someone back to jail because he hadn't finished his mandatory sentence when he's clearly not a risk, when he's done exactly, as you said, exactly what it is that we would want someone to do. That's where you get to see that these things aren't serving the goal. And I'm sure that someone somewhere would say, well, the goal of that is parity, so that if you are arrested here or you're arrested on the West Coast, you're generally speaking receiving parity. But what it does is, okay, there might be parity, but it's perhaps at a much stricter, more stringent level than it needs to be. I think there's a lot of value in recognizing the pipeline towards prison that we see in so many of our communities. When you look even at the level of students who are expelled in the preschool level, or students who are receiving significant punishments, even in elementary school, we are in so many ways treating children or addressing a childhood school issues as criminal issues. And sometimes they are. I'm not saying that that's not the case, but sometimes in many cases, and when you look at the disproportionate way that minority communities receive stricter sentences, or suspensions or expulsions from school, we see where that becomes a problem, and that puts kids on a path towards having fewer options, potentially towards higher rates of criminality. And frankly, for me, going a couple steps away from the criminal justice reform question, if we can look at our investment in education at an earlier stage, studies show that when there is a stronger public education or a stronger level of education for children, there are lower rates of criminality, higher rates of civic engagement, and better health outcomes. So even recognizing that if we see ourselves in this place, if we find ourselves in this place where we have such a significant portion of our population in prison, how could we, even at a very early stage, see some of our interventions in public school funding, ensuring that kids are not hungry when they're at school? Because I'm sure most of the listeners, anyone with a child or even adult in their life, sometimes when people are hungry, they are not their best selves. So your ability to learn, your ability or your propensity to be a discipline problem, we have to recognize that those are the sorts of problems that exist when kids in schools aren't being given some of the tools for success. And then when that does pipeline towards a lack of opportunity or fewer options when someone is exiting high school, that's where we see significant issues. We also need to acknowledge that a lot of people in our jails have substance use disorders. So we keep imprisoning people who, due to a mental health issue, due to an addiction, due to a substance use disorder, are finding themselves putting themselves on the wrong side of the law. But how is it that if we don't get at that root cause, they will keep getting there? And the data show that time and time again. So I think if we are to make changes to our criminal justice system, we need to recognize that disparities exist in it. We need to recognize that if we are to address a problem of recidivism, we need to also address some of the root causes of recidivism. So I mentioned substance use disorder. Also, we need to make sure that people are prepared to re-enter our communities, because if someone is exiting a jail or prison and doesn't have a driver's license, or is returning back to the same community, or isn't necessarily allowed to return to the public housing community where their parents live because of restrictions on public housing and felony convictions or drug-related felony convictions, we're putting people in, we are not setting people up for success. And I am not talking about, special treatment. I am talking about truly just saying, you've now paid your debt to society. We support you. Please go out. You've learned a skill, perhaps. You've taken a class, anything that would allow for someone to have that first step forward and then they can go on from there. But just ensuring that people have some basic level of opportunity and that they're prepared to reenter our communities is incredibly important. And so, where from a legislative perspective we can really have impact is through funding of reentry programs. It's through federal funding of substance use disorder programs that affect the prison population. It's through addressing mandatory sentencing. It's through addressing our bail and cash bail programs, because disproportionately lower income individuals are impacted. So you get arrested for something, you're put in jail, you can't pay your bail, you lose your job, you're acquitted, or ultimately don't go to jail for it, or depending upon the sentencing, but you've now lost your job, you've now potentially, the setback there is so significant. And so when we look at where legislation can have an impact, it's in all of those places to ensure that we need a strong criminal justice system, but we also need it to be fair, and we need it to serve the goal that it's meant to serve, which is it's not just a punitive system. It's preparing people. It should be preparing people to pay their debt to society, as we say, and then rejoin society.
Thank you very much. One of the questions that's come in is, how do you feel about the idea that we have?
I can see
you can see this. How do you feel about the idea that that only a man can win in this district, and that only a
So just because it's only ever been a man who's won this district does not mean that only a man can win this district. For the past 50 years, a Republican man has been the one to win this district. That doesn't mean that won't change this time. I think I recognize that there's this excitement, this fever pitch about the idea that we could flip this seat in 40 years, not 50. There's this excitement about the idea that we can win this seat for the first time, and we want to make sure that we're on this perfect path towards doing it. But I will say this, I have been working every single day to create a perfect path towards it. We have, in this district, it's about ensuring that everyone, we will win this seat when everyone turns out to vote. We will win this seat when everyone believes it's winnable. And so there is no right or wrong profile. It is about having a candidate who is engaging people and creating the infrastructure to beat our incumbent in November. And I think that it's helpful when people share this as a concern, because then it's something that I can address. But I will say that when we flip seats and Dawn Adams won her seat, and Deborah Rodman won her seat, and 11 out of the 15 House of Delegates members across the state of Virginia, those seats were won by women, and those were women who had, not all of them, but some of them had men in their primaries or their nominating process. Right? We have Danica, who's amazing. So we have a strong precedent of where people got this level of worry. Well, this is such a great opportunity. I don't want to lose it. Perhaps we need to have the image of what a congressperson should be, and that's not a woman. Yes, it's not a woman, because Congress is only 19.1% of Congress is made up of women. So if we continue expecting that Congress looks a certain way, we won't have as many women, we won't have as many minorities, we won't have members of the LGBTQ community, we won't have people with disabilities. Because if we're always just assuming it has to be what it always is, nothing will ever change. And for me, one of the reasons that I'm running is because I believe that we need new voices involved in this conversation. We need different perspectives. And so I happen to be a woman, and that informs my worldview, but I also happen to be a parent. I also happen to be a former intelligence professional. I also happen to be active in my community. I happen to be married. All of these things. I am not very athletic. All of these things inform who I am and what it is that I'm bringing to this race. And I think one of the exciting things is We do have over 1,200 people registered to volunteer with our campaign. We're approaching, right now, I forgot the current numbers, but I'm looking over at Justin. We've got over 1,800 people who have contributed financially to this campaign. So clearly there are a lot of people who not only believe that a woman can win this district, but believe that it's worth spending their time and their money and their resources on that belief. And so one of the things that we've been doing and I've been doing is getting out and engaging people, because people do need to believe that this seat is winnable, and people do need to see the infrastructure that we've built. And I'm a tremendously hard worker, and that's why there are signs all over the place. There are events all over the place, because we need that infrastructure now, because we need to build on it more towards November. And, and it's exciting. And I have had, so many people react really positively and excited about our campaign. And I want people to vote for me because I have a tremendous campaign structure. I want people to vote for me because they align with the ideas and the principles that I espouse. I want people to vote for me because they believe that I will fight for them and that I will work for them and that I will be accountable to them. But I also want people to recognize that until we're ready to shift the what Congress looks like, we shouldn't necessarily expect tremendous shifts in the way they legislate. So, this is a conversation that I've had, and certainly when we even look at how women are doing their primaries across the country. I was on MSNBC last night because they were highlighting all of these women. I think the number is 45 out of 65 of the primaries where there's been a woman, at least one woman and at least one man. It's been a woman who's won. So I think a lot of places where historically either women haven't run or people have had this notion that it's being disrupted. It's being disrupted. And even in Virginia's 5th district, where they already have their nominee, that was a primary. There were originally 3 men. Well, there had been some people, but headed into their nominating process, there were 3 men and 1 woman, and the woman won, and with a resounding victory. And their community is far more rural or far more kind of expansive in landmass than we are. So I think there's so many examples to say that while I understand that based on our history, people would say that. I mean, you can't shift things until you believe that shift is possible. And so if anyone who says, I don't know that a woman can win, I think how can you say that if you also don't say, I don't think a Democrat can win? Because we're looking to upend multiple things.
That has also been said about the 7.
Well, I would like to argue both of those points.
I appreciate it. I totally appreciate it. I do want to ask you a couple of different things, and we are running down on time, so it's going to come quick.
All right.
Okay. Fun. So a couple of different things are, I've heard you already talk about the need to move on to renewable energy from multiple perspectives. One is the environmental concern. Secondly, security concerns. Talk about how we get infrastructure improvements in our country while we are not busy overfunding our military. Is that the right way to say that? And if you don't mind, discuss a little bit for me, a positive spin on public-private collaboration that doesn't wind us up in the place where we feel like we do about for-profit prisons right now.
Yeah. So I think looking at infrastructure, we'll talk about broadband internet because that's a top issue in the 7th district, not as predominant here in Chesterfield, but throughout many of our more rural counties. So there's a couple pieces to it. We need to recognize that so far the free market has not brought internet to much of our district because laying the lines that go towards a 20-acre farm it's just not, there's no free market necessity there. So where we can create incentives, where we can ensure that people have that access, I think that we should. And if we look back to when we were expanding in terms of electricity and electrical access, in the early 1930s, there was a bill that went before Congress, the Rural Electrification Act, and basically it provided for the notion that it's important to have electricity across our communities, and they were never going to find electricity companies were never going to find their way towards some more rural communities. So we need to ensure that any private enterprise is regulated and is that's perhaps not the right word, that the incentives that they have are based on what's benefiting the community and people, and ensuring that there is a place for government in ensuring that, again, with broadband internet access, that we are moving towards ensuring that communities are positively impacted, and that through incentivizing companies or cooperatives, that the goal is to ensure that those localities do have access to broadband.
Which brings me to my next point.
Okay.
How do we keep them from getting completely out of control on the other side? And we have a wonderful view of that right here in Virginia right now going on when we talk about the potential infrastructure being laid out for moving fracked gas from Ohio out to our coastline. You may or may not have heard that I've done a couple programs on the pipeline.
I just want to compliment your transition first, because you're welcome. I'm sorry, your question.
Yeah, thank you. So, how do we effectively do that so that we are encouraging this business? Because I personally am a proponent for municipal owned broadband, and then your population is cared for. Yes.
Yeah,
because I think it's a utility, and because we've proven that's how we're using it now.
And we've certainly seen localities where, outside the 7th District, where they have really taken that on, and there's great success where providing significant access has been great for their business, because it's an investment essentially in your business-friendly infrastructure, and we've seen that. And I think, so jumping ahead to what I think your question is related to, where we find ourselves now with the pipeline issue, it goes back to being able to recognize, or through, I guess, the regulatory process. And so if we're looking at the FERC process, for example, I personally have concerns about how that process went, because not all of the commissioners were in place. It was a partial, it was not everyone who needed to, it was, only a small portion, or 3 out of the 5 commissioners were in place. It wasn't a unanimous vote, and historically they often vote unanimously. So the fact that there was a divided vote with fewer commissioners in seat than normal, there's a lot of things where I think that we as Virginians or people on the East Coast could express some of concern related to that particular vote.
Are you then supporting Tim Kaine's measure
to have a rehearing?
Yeah,
absolutely.
Okay. Thank you.
And for this reason, because there are some questions related to there are a lot of questions related to the environmental impact, the racial justice impact, the eminent domain impact. And I think that if we felt better, and I say we as like a greater people, if we could say, look, it went through this process from A to Z, this was the process, every one of these concerns was taken into consideration, this is where we find ourselves, I think it would be a lot more palatable for people to accept the outcome, or to feel that there aren't as many risks. But when looking at the way that the FERC process did go in this particular case, I think that there are just pointing to the timer.
You can go longer.
Thank you. But I think that's exactly the issue. And as Virginians, of course, we're interested in what's happening here in Virginia and within our region. But I do think that there's a larger, from a national perspective, discussion, because when it's not our pipeline, it'll be somebody else's pipeline. And when it's not an investment in fracked gas that's kind of coming through our state or through the Commonwealth, it's going to be somewhere else. So I think ensuring that we believe that the system for these sorts of approvals is strong, and being well utilized, that's incredibly important, because while we care about this issue because it's here, I think that we should also have a national view and recognize that if we say, well, we take issue with the process and how it happened, and that also allows us to potentially proactively protect other localities, or proactively protect other localities.
Excellent. Thank you.
Okay.
And I did come about that by having lived in another place and then returned to Richmond, Virginia, and saw what was happening and started hearing the rumblings about the pipelines. And I was like, are you kidding?
Where
This
were
is
you?
such a bad idea. I was out on the West Coast, where you might be living right next door to.
Yeah.
No, you don't let somebody do that.
We had, so I, for a time, lived on the West Coast, and between our house and the grocery store, we went by 3 or 4 drills. They were, actually, they were right across the street from the grocery store, and we lived right on the water as well.
Yeah.
So, and it's interesting because it just became part of your normal.
It definitely is. It definitely is. But this is the stuff that I learned.
too.
Right. And this is the stuff that I learned while I was living out there. There were entire communities that, all of a sudden everybody has to get up and move. Nobody gets any value out of their house because, I'm sorry, oops, we poisoned the land. Time to go. And I'm like, whoops, that's a really big whoops. You should not let people come in and do that where they're not already doing that. I was just shocked to see Virginia even considering any of this kind of stuff. And it's been kind of coming, and I've been hearing the rumblings for a while. And then certainly watching the example in Oklahoma, where, okay, well, we're going to frack everything that we can until we can't stand it. Oh, wait a minute. Now the earth shakes all the time. And when they backed off, it stopped. So we know for sure what's happening.
And I think, for people who want to be involved in this conversation, I think it's also really important that we talk about, well, what are the alternatives? And certainly, we're not yet in a place where we can go 100% renewable by any stretch of the imagination. But we need to be able to talk about where should our priorities be. And I think that there's a great deal of importance in turning towards renewables and ensuring that, we want to work towards a path of being able to depend on renewable energy. And we want to build that infrastructure. And you can't just flip a switch overnight, and I think everyone recognizes that. But when you kind of double down on where we are now, that is, it isn't a zero-sum game, but it is certainly, if you're doubling down on where we are now, you're certainly not being as proactive on, energy sources of the future or large-scale energy sources of the future.
I think one of the things that I identify with in the American spirit, if you will, is a certain sense of optimism.
Yeah.
And so it generally shocks me to hear people say, poo-poo, no, we can't do this, that, and the other. Because I say, did we or did we not decide, and then within 10 years, get a man on the moon and safely back?
Yep.
Did we or did we not do this, that, and the other thing? And then just to hear this, oh, no, we can't do that. Oh, and it's never been done before, So I appreciate a lot of what you're talking about. You're just ready. I see you're just ready for, it's time to change. Let's go now. Yeah. And I really appreciate that because I'm there.
and I recognize, it's not, you don't flip a switch and it changes, right. But sometimes it's a teeny tiny step forward. Sometimes it's a leap forward. And I think that for me is when I'm looking at how can we achieve progress in this country, and I'm a big believer in really restoring civility to our conversations and working towards compromise so that we can have long lasting legislation where we're not volleying back and forth between parties and ideology. But anytime we're moving forward, be it, a tiny kind of pitter patter forward or a leap forward, I think is forward progress that we should be working towards achieving. And to just stand still because you don't know how to move forward or because you're nervous about it or unwilling to believe it's possible. Back to the larger 7th district, we've had some conversations. I've had conversations with voters in some of our more red counties that say, oh, I don't know, Amelia County will never go blue. And it's about saying, but Amelia County doesn't have to go blue. Amelia County is part of the 7th district. And let's talk about the 7th district because we want Chesterfield and Henrico to go blue. Maybe Nottoway County will go blue. Everywhere else, we need to raise the amount of Democratic voters and engagement. And so even just talking about, what's our grand scheme plan in the 7th? I've now leapt from renewable energy to voter turnout. I think that's giving people a vision for how it's possible, because if you don't have the vision for how something's possible, in this case, flipping the 7th district, then it's hard to get on board with the notion that you can be a part of something really positive. And so to wrap up on this level of optimism, which is something I think is incredibly important. It's who we are as Americans, and why I think we've had such an incredible, successful country is that we are a place where people have this boundless optimism that they can start some crazy company or invent something interesting, or they can show up here with the equivalent of $5 in their pocket and
right. Run off
amazing.
into the woods and then go discover the other coast.
Exactly. And so all of those things are possible. So clearly flipping the seventh district is
perfect. Absolutely. Well, do you want to do another one or two, or
I'm going to
look
look towards
to
Justin because we have to go to
I know that you
event.
have other things to do. I have just a few quickly. No, one. Okay. Very quickly. I want to. How many of these you can answer in a minute?
Okay.
I want to know your favorite color.
Red.
Food.
Oh,
It's a hard one.
Peanut butter.
Season.
Fall.
Supreme Court Justice.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Visual artist.
Gustav Klimt.
Ice cream.
Cookies and cream.
Excellent.
There we go.
All right, Abigail, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on In the Frequency of Hope today. Thank you so much for joining us here at 93.9, the Work FM. And I'll be back tonight at 7 o'clock. We'll be talking to Dan Ward. So I'll talk to you, Chesterfield, a little bit later.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for watching or listening.
And we now will return you to our regularly in motion, in progress Pacifica programming.
Left to fall on impacted communities and the court system. It really matters little who gets in office regarding the pipelines. The Water Control Board will meet in December.